It's our pleasure to welcome back to the museum Ken Smith. Ken Smith is among, I think, the most innovative and interesting landscape architects practicing on the world stage today. You may know him through his larger public work, Orange County Great Park in Southern California, for example, or more recently his collaboration with Shop on the East River Esplanade. What you may not have followed is that Ken has also maintained a cultural practice in addition to his public work that involves often installation, refers often to conceptual art practices, and most often deals with synthetic materials. I'm thinking here of the roof garden of the Museum of Modern Art, for example, or his installation on the facade at the Cooper Hewitt. It was in that context that the museum invited Ken to conceive of an installation on the campus for 2015, and it's in that space that he's produced the Fenway Deity. The Fenway Deity, as you see it on the Fenway facade, will be up through September of this year here, and it sits within a line of Ken's work that he's described as garden deities. He'll say more about that in his remarks in just a moment. While we don't yet have necklaces available, you can find in gift at the Gardner downstairs garden and Fenway deity postcards, so stay tuned about the necklaces.
I think one of the things about my work is that I'm always thinking about what I do in relationship to gardens and how they speak and work as gardens. I'm Ken Smith. I'm trained as a landscape architect, and landscape architecture is a field that deals with the environmental health of our cities, primarily our urban areas. And so I've been working on urban parks and public spaces most of my career. So this project really brings together both the ideas about environmental health of the city and the artistry of what we make and how art enriches our lives. Isabella Stewart Gardner had a very eclectic collection. I mean, basically, she traveled and acquired things. And part of my education as a landscape architect was traveling and seeing gardens and palaces and temples. And so I'm collecting ideas in the same way that Gardner was collecting art and objects and things. The first thing I did was actually visit the museum again. It had been a number of years since I had been there. And I think that the thing I really like about the collection is the eclectic mix of East and West. And I think that it is that mixing of ideas from the East and West that's sort of at the heart of what the deity is about, because the deity is, of course, an Eastern idea, but we're using it in kind of a Western way here. I very much wanted to deal with the front of the building and the relationship to the Fenway. That was very clear to me. So the deities are about protecting some realm. It's a protector of the fens. And so I think the Fenway deity on the front is reasserting the primacy of the historic facade, and it's really enforcing the environmental health and goodwill and beauty of the Fenway. There's also an interesting relationship between our contemporary culture and the historic collection and artifact of the museum itself. I think that the deity on the front of the building speaks to the wheel window on the back wall of the historic building. And in some ways, then all of her eclectic collection and her Asian art and Western art, that all becomes the demi-deity and sort of the spiritual wrapping around that enforces or gives power to the big deity on the front. I had been doing a series of deities since the early to mid-90s, and so I wanted to pick up on that strain of ideas that I've been working with, but I wanted to do one in a very different way than the earlier ones. And the original one was constructed out of synthetic turf and kind of these mirrored domes. And so it was not particularly tasteful. It had a certain vulgarity to it. And actually, when you go to even the traditional temples, the Buddhas are often gilded, sometimes polychromed. And so there is a certain vulgarity or flashiness to the construction of deities, even in sacred space. And so for this installation, the deity is psychedelic and actually quite strongly configured and bold. And when I first hung it on the front of the building as a drawing, It was interesting because the building has those two chimneys and it has that kind of V-shaped flue that configures the front facade. And the placement of the deity made a lot of sense at the V shape of that flue, but it sort of hung there in an odd way. And it was sort of the idea of the gold team and actually letting it hang from the chimneys that really made it work, because it actually now is an adornment for the building. It actually hangs from the building in a way that seems kind of correct. And I wanted the deity to be essentially soft. And so the idea of doing it out of printed vinyl and inflatable, so it was kind of pillowy, really appealed to me because of the kind of inherent softness and approachability and friendliness, if you will. And I sort of imagine Isabella Stewart Gardner throwing a party and erecting the most amazing flower arrangement in the middle of the center of the museum. And in some ways, this installation is another temporary version of that same kind of celebration of garden and flowers. Clearly, some people will love it and some people will hate it, and from my perspective, that's just fine. The Fenway deity is, in fact, a provocative act. I mean, it's provocative to do something on the front of the museum, and the deity itself is not a shy gesture, because its role is really to spark a debate and make people think and talk about the museum and its relationship to the city.
Please welcome Ken Smith.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I'm always kind of amazed that the museum let me do this. So I'll give the presentation tonight is in two parts. So the first part is about the deity, and the second part is a little bit about the rest of the work in my practice. So I practice in New York City. This is where my office is. It's a very urban place, and I really have sort of grown my practice, and the filter that I think about landscape really is through that lens of urban space and dealing with cultural places and the social space of cities. This is my garden at my house. There are 17 swamp white oaks that I salvaged from a site. I was on one of my projects during the maintenance day, and the workers, they had a big acorn fall the year before, and there were lots of little sprouts, and they were dutifully pulling them all up and throwing them away. And so I shoved 17 of them into my coffee cup and took them home and planted. And this is the third year. They're quite happy. My neighbor Merle Temkin, if I can, my neighbor looks out at them and she says, "Ken, your oak trees are adorable." And then she adds, "But of course they won't live." And they're doing quite well. I don't even water them. So the deity, well, this is kind of an early version, if you will. When I started my practice, right out of graduate school, I decided I would go somewhere every year that I hadn't been before to study the gardens, architecture traditions. And so I took my first bonus that I got working for Peter Walker and Martha Schwartz, and I went to France and visited all the Lenote gardens. And then I went to India, and I went to Japan, and ultimately China and Korea and Germany and Italy and Spain and a lot of places. And so that was really part of my education. And I was always traveling, it seemed, in the wintertime. Which didn't bother me because I was always interested in the bone structure of the gardens. And you can tell the bone structure of a garden in the winter. You don't need the ephemera of the flowers and things to know if a garden is good or not. And in my early projects, my clients were always asking about flowers. And I wasn't interested in flowers at all. But people kept provoking me about flowers, and could we have flowers? And so finally, I just decided, well, fuck that. I'm going to give you flowers if that's what you want. And so there's been this whole endeavor about flowers, the spinning pinwheel flowers, and of course the deity. when I was in Japan, first time I went to Japan was in, I think it was '89. It was on business. I went to Japan a couple times on business, and then later I went just on my own with more time to go to the sites. And I was going to the temples and the shrines, and Japanese culture is pretty interesting. This is Byodoin. This is at the Phoenix Hall in Uji, just outside of Kyoto. And this is a 900-year-old wood temple, which, as a Westerner, it was kind of mind-boggling. That kind of, twisted my head inside out to think of anything 900 years old, and to think of a wood building that could last 900 years. And this is the big Buddha, the Daibutsu. And what I found interesting about the construction of these temples was that the Daibutsu always was surrounded by little deities, the demi-deities, and that there's a kind of a role that the big Buddha plays, supported by all the little Buddhas, the little demi-deities. And so this piece here is really playing off of that. So the first version of this endeavor was in a small bar on the Lower East Side, Max Fish, in about 1995. A friend of mine who is a hairdresser organized it and invited her friends, and the theme for the show was Deity for a Day. And so I did the first the deities, the ones you saw in the video, made out of astroturf and the mirrored domes. And there was a great big one, and then I had a whole series of little ones. And when I put them up, the little ones all had a name tag on them. One was Labyrinth, and one was, Parterre, and one was, the Compost and things. Because each of the little deities had their own little specialized field of power that they helped to reinforce the power of the big deity. And then this version came about in around 2001. This is the digital reworking of the original, and it was originally issued as screensavers back when we had screensavers on our computers. And then there are other variants. This one isn't the deity per se, but this was an installation at Cooper Hewitt Museum that uses the same kind of flower iconography. And in this case, this is playing off of a kind of random selection, chance operation, and the detail of it. And it was made entirely out of construction materials. These are all industrial materials, construction fencing, and these are all filter fabrics that they put underneath the soils and things when they're building highways. I don't know why they come in those great colors, but they do, so I used that. And so when I was asked to think about doing something at the Gardner, you can see that's the wheel window right there on the back side. I remembered when the new building, the Lorenzo Piano Edition, was added to the building. I remember one of the critiques that was made, and I don't know if it was a valid critique, but I remember one of the critiques was that the museum was turning its back on the Fenway. You used to enter the front of the building, and the front of the building had a relationship with the Fenway and the city, and that with the new building, that was all reversed, and you actually entered the back of the building. And so I'd kind of thought about that for a few years, and I thought, well, actually, that might be a little bit valid. And so I wanted to work on the front of the building. I thought there was something interesting about the historic facade, and that with all the success of the new building and sort of the reorientation, the historic front of the building was somehow forgotten. And so that's why I started looking at the front. And the building is interesting as I've actually, when we were hanging the piece a month ago, people kept asking questions about the building and what I thought of the building, and people said, well, the building is really quite plain. And I guess it is, but in some ways it's actually a modern building. It's a kind of a warehouse for art, and it actually is an envelope that protects the art. It's a very kind of impenetrable building, and it's quite solid at the base, and the windows up high are quite large to let light in for the viewing of the art. But it's I think, intentionally a kind of severe building on the outside because it's all about the interior. And then this is, of course, the proposal, the piece. And then this is the kind of more careful version on the historic drawing, really looking at the scale and proportion. And there were a number of studies that happened over the last year as we were putting it together. And this one had to do with what it would look like from inside the museum. Because there is a relationship of seeing the backside of the deity in relationship to the Tiepolo or the Rubens that are nearby. And so we did a complete full mock-up. We cut out full-scale pieces of printed paper to actually hang in the windows so that the curators could see what the relationship would be between it and the art. And apparently that went well enough that we moved forward. And actually, I think if you go up, I think it's actually kind of an interesting relationship. What I realized looking at the Rubens is that, the colors are quite bold in that painting. And it was kind of interesting to see it in relationship with a contemporary gesture. The other thing that was really critical was how you viewed it from the front on the Fenway. And what I realized when I did this study was that the chain had to actually hang a little odd. It actually had to sit very high on the chimney so that your viewing angles from either sidewalk allowed you to actually see the entire chain. And then we took it into computer modeling. This actually happened fairly late. We were issuing the files for fabrication and doing this, and we realized we needed to raise it up another 10 feet. And so we were reconstructing things on the eve of the fabrication. And then during fabrication, this is a mock-up of the chain, and I think everybody thought that the chain was going to be like those Christmas ornaments, where it actually was links, and I wanted it to actually be much faker than that. I wanted it to actually not be a chain, but to be the image of a chain. But I still wanted it to have depth and shadow. And so the fabricator was worried, and she was cautioning me that it wasn't going to look good. She said it's going to look like one of those cheap Mylar balloons. And I said, exactly, that's perfect, that's what I want. And so then everything was fine. But she was worried. And then it was fabricated by an inflatable manufacturer located in San Diego. I mean, mostly they make things for used car lots and gas stations and model homes and stuff. And so I think this is one of their test inflations. And there's another view of it before it was shipped east. And this was the hanging. It took 2 days to put it up. Mostly what you probably don't see there's some very substantial steel brackets at the back. We worked with Bureau Happold. We had like super best engineers to make sure that it worked, and the whole project had to go through Boston Landmarks, and so everything was very carefully pre-planned, and everything was executed very carefully because it's a historic building, and we had to be very careful of the building. And that's when finally went up and was inflated. I think this is really the best view because you really do understand the connection of it and the Fenway. And I think that it's beautiful seeing it reflected in the water, and you really start to understand the strong connection between the museum and the Fenway, and you really start to understand sort of the issues of environmental health of the Fenway and the need for it to be renewed and cleaned up and restored really to a much more correct version of what it was intended to be. Street view, and then this is sort of the formal view. And throughout the putting up the piece, people kept asking me, what would Isabel Stewart Gardner think? And of course, I have no idea what she would think, but I think she might have liked it. So the second part is really talking about sort of contemporary landscape architecture from my perspective. And I think we live in a very data-driven era, and most of what we do in life is really driven by metrics of some sort. We certainly have minimal standards for everything, and we all live by those minimal standards. And there's all kinds of performance criteria about how something needs to function and operate and carry on through time. And there's all sorts of best practices that we achieve to do. And in a lot of architectural and landscape practice, the entire enterprise is largely driven by meeting the guidelines and the requirements and the metrics. And there's nothing wrong with that because it actually elevates everything to a very good level of performance. But from my perspective, that's not enough. It's actually important to go beyond the metrics and think about what you're creating as an expression, as something that's created by humans for humans with cultural content. So I'm very interested in the expressive power of the medium of landscape and what it says and how it operates. And I think of landscape really as a container of ideas for expressing ideas. And I think landscape is an agent for change to improve things. And so I think part of the reason why I practice in urban areas is because humans need to live in urban areas. It's an ethical way to protect the planet, and we need good spaces for people and good urbanism to make that work. So I want to talk about program and craft and social space. And program is interesting because almost all of our projects start with a program statement about what the project is supposed to achieve. And it's always occurred to me that the program statements oftentimes don't really describe what the project wants to be or could be or needs to be. It's a statement sometimes not even correct in how it's put together. And I found that generally you have to go sort of behind the statements of what the program is about and try to go beyond the words and actually try to figure out what it is it's really trying to be. So I had a client in New York City, actually a friend and her husband who live on the 39th floor penthouse on Park Avenue, have a little terrace. It's 20 feet by 21 feet. And they have a very unusual condition in that the window washers for cleaning the building have to come down and move across their terrace 4 times a year. And so they wanted the garden, but whatever we put out there had to completely move out of the way 4 times a year for the window washing, which is very complicated. And most terrace gardens are really ultimately about the container. And so my client travels a lot to Asia and collects scholar rocks. And so I knew that my client would be interested in this kind of idea of a container. This is, of course, in Suzhou, but a kind of beautiful container and plants. And this is what we created, beautiful containers with plants. This is sideways. We had some technical problems. But at one point, my client's husband sort of half-heartedly said that maybe it could all be on wheels, and we just roll it out of the way when the window washers came. And I thought, yeah, actually, that's a good idea. So that's what we did. And so it's a series of sculptural forms that have voids for enough soil to grow an assortment of plants. And my clients decided to not have automatic irrigation. It was problematic if it's moving around, and to have permanent irrigation. And so they committed to hand watering, which I think is great. Anytime you can get a client who will hand water their garden, it means they love the garden or are watching it. And my client is really interested in plants, so they change out the plants all the time. Each year it's some different thing, and that's fine with me also. I did the plants the first year, but since then they do the plants. So it's always some strange and interesting thing. Craft is the other thing that I'm interested in. When I was in school, of course, craft was considered kind of lowly thing, not really important. That was, something that, I guess you'd hire somebody to figure out how to put something together, and we were taught that it was the ideas that were really important. But it seems to me that craft is important, and that if you're going to build something well, it has to really express its materials in a beautiful way. And I've so many times had contractors tell me, well, just tell me what you want it to look like and we'll figure out how to make it that way. And that's always bothered me, because it just seems to be kind of dishonest, that you really have to understand the materiality to make it work properly. So I'll show, this is a big project I'll show a little bit later, but I just want to show this one piece of, this is a water treatment plant in the Bronx, and I'm doing the golf driving range that sits on top of it. And that's a story I'll tell you about in a moment. But very late in the process, after we had completed the construction documents and it was actually under construction, the fire department inspectors came in and determined that we had to have a fire lane around the entire perimeter of the golf driving range, outlined in red here. And I didn't want to have a strongly configured road wrapping around the perimeter of my space, and I was, but I can't fight the fire department. So but I did get them to agree we could use permeable pavers, grass pavers, so that would diminish it a bit. And so what I did was I decided that we could take the pavers and keep the pavers absolutely orthogonal throughout. And because they have to follow a curve all the way around, that as the pavers shift to the geometry of the curve, we'll have an imperfect edge. And normally, the imperfect edge would be considered to be bad craft, that you would want a clean edge. But in this case, I didn't want a clean edge. And the contractor argued with me about this and wanted me to put in an edge restraint to have a clean edge. And I said, no, we don't have to do that. This would work. And there's a very precise formula. You start, and the moment something gets out of the register of the red lines, you stop laying down the pavers. And it's all orthogonal, so it's very easy. And the beauty for the contractor, if the contractor had actually been thinking, was that they don't have to cut a single paver in the entire project. So it's like super easy for them, and it's super workable. But they argued with me anyway. But they did it my way. And it does produce an interesting fuzzy edge. And so this is when we were installing it. And the edge is quite imprecise. And this is this year as the grass is starting to come in. And so it does produce a kind of edge condition that is not precise, but yet it follows a very prescribed functional relationship. And then the third element, I think, is really dealing with social and environmental space. It's kind of critical to our work. And this is where the project in the East River waterfront that I've been working on for 11 years now, I think, comes into play. And really the social infrastructure of the seating. And this is working with shop architects and Amanda Burden, who was the city planning commissioner at the time. And Amanda was really a disciple of Holly White and really takes seriously the social space of urban places and particularly interested in seating. And so we created a kit of parts that could create different seating situations throughout the park in a controlled but variable way. And so there are chaise lounges and benches, and some have backs and some have arms, and some don't. Some you can actually lay down on, which I actually think is a very good thing in public space. We've all been taught that you shouldn't be able to lay down in space, that somehow that's bad, but I think that on these long benches, to be able to lay down and look at the sky is a perfectly fine thing. And we did mock-ups. This is Amanda testing out the seat to make sure that it's comfortable. And this shows some of the various situations. And the one at the top left is interesting to me. We spent a tremendous amount of time on that particular seating circumstance because Amanda wanted to have a social situation where you could sit and talk to somebody sitting next to you, or you could sit and talk to somebody sitting across from you. And that social space also was perfect for putting your feet up. And so it did some very interesting and I think worthwhile things. And then the bar lounges, the bar seats are very popular. But I would say I would also have a critique of sort of our understanding of social space today. Holly White did the pioneering research in the 60s and 70s looking at the urban plazas in New York City. And today that's still the most up-to-date research that most landscape architects use. Most landscape architects actually go by gut instinct. Most landscape architects have pretty good gut instinct, but we're still operating on gut instinct in 40 or 50-year-old research. And you go to spaces like this, Google and Facebook and Amazon know much more about predictive behavior of how we're going to operate in spaces. They know where we're taking pictures and what attracts us. But landscape architects are relatively uninformed by behavioral social research. And I think our schools have not really done very much social research for the last 30 years. And I think we really need to circle back and really start looking much more seriously at behavioral social psychology of how people use spaces and respond to spaces and urban places and interaction. And I think it will actually allow us to create much better responsive public spaces. We have a series of public uses. This is a beer garden. I think beer gardens are also good for public space. People love the beer garden, and it actually is a good social generator. There's also an elevated deck. And these guys are having a conversation with each other, right? And this is not something Holly White would have predicted. Or that guy's photographing his girlfriend and she's talking on her phone. I mean, it's interesting the way that social life is different now because of digital media and how we act in public space. So 2 projects. The first one is a residence in Southern California. My client is an art collector, big collector of Chris Burden. They have a bulldozer in their foyer. And this is what their landscape looked like. It's turf lawn, which doesn't make any sense in Southern California. Beautiful old pine tree. A set of terraces that I hated, but ended up keeping. But good clients. I did 2 early studies. I wanted to rip the terraces out. This was kind of a boulder field landslide post-earthquake kind of landscape, which they found very entertaining and interesting. The other was a little more classically formed with a central terrace that had big stones you walked over. But at the end they said, my clients are in their late 70s, early 80s, and they said, but we don't know if we really want to tear everything up and live through 5 years of reconstructing things. And so I said, well, I think we can probably do something interesting with the terraces that you have. And so the program here was to get rid of the turf lawn and do something interesting. And because my clients are elderly, they were having a great deal of difficulty getting up and down the stairs. They needed a handrail, and at night it was badly lit. So this was the scheme to put in a contemporary parterre garden of low water usage regime and to create a hand railing. And they also wanted the new gate at the front. So the parterres are very simple. They're crushed glass and crushed stone, and mostly succulents and grasses. So it's a very sipping garden. Sips water. It doesn't drink water. And then the handrail was a big thing. This is the second full-scale mock-up of the handrail. The first one was so bad I don't show it. The entire handrail was modeled in Rhino, so it was an all computer 3D model. The drawings were all created from the Rhino model, so they were very precise in terms of the radiuses and everything. And the contractor in the first mock-up interpreted the drawings rather than following the requirements of the drawings, which was a big problem for me. But it was a contractor that I had worked with before. They were a steel fence contractor. They were the low bidder. I had worked with them before, and they had done a mock-up during DD, so I knew that they could do it. And so this is the second mock-up, and here they're getting the geometries correct. And this is the third mock-up with the metal, the flange welded onto it. And basically in vertical elevation, it's absolutely rigorous, absolutely rational. It's absolutely a fixed number of inches above the surface. So it follows the terrace, it follows the steps, it follows the terrace, it follows the steps. Absolutely functional, absolutely clear. In horizontal elevation, it really only needed to function at the steps. And so when you moved away from the steps, the railing was actually free to do something else, which it does. This was the fourth mock-up. And so you can see the handrail, code radius. The channel is for the continuous LED light that will run down it, and then the flange. And this is at one of the joints, so it's a slip joint, and it gets bolted together in the field. And the whole thing is, I think, four pieces. So this is what it looks like from the front with the new gate. That is a kind of a limited view. You can see the Pacific Ocean in the background. And this is what it looks like with the garden. And so you can see the horizontal control, the vertical control follows the slopes, and you can see the horizontal control where it does whatever it wants in some places. And this is the daytime view, and this is the nighttime view. And it in fact does light the path very nicely. And then the last project is the Croton Reservoir water treatment plant golf driving range. That's a program concept. It's a water treatment plant because New York City needs to bring its drinking water into federal compliance with the Clean Water Drinking Act. It's a golf driving range because the city decided to build it in a municipal park, in a municipal golf course, and the site was historically a golf driving range. And so the requirements were that the original topography had to be put back more or less as it was, and the original function had to be returned to the site. This is what it looked like 5 years ago. The plant is dug 90 feet deep. It's a 9-acre plant, 90 feet deep, dug out of solid bedrock. This is the plan for the project that was approved by the city. Treatment plant is a high security facility. This plant meets State Department standards similar to an embassy. And because of the pedestrian and vehicular interdiction requirements, it required continuous walls around the entire facility. So there are 2 miles of walls that I got to design, which is actually kind of an amazingly big landscape. And the walls give structure to this large form that actually obscures the exact outline of the plant below grade, which is also a security function. And then the walls are complex because they have to relate to the existing grades. They have a program requirement of height for security. And so typically the ground level is never parallel with the top level of the walls. They're always going in some counterpoint to each other. And I think the very first thing I said on the project was that we were not going to have any jaggies. We were not going to have steps in the top of the walls, that the walls had to follow the terrain in some way. And so the entire set of walls were designed from the top down. All the stone coursing works from the top down, which is, of course, the opposite of how you actually build a wall. But it's possible if you plan it properly. This is the first mock-up of the stone coursing to show that you could indeed have walls that sloped and curved and bent and have the stone coursing work from the top down. This is the on-site mock-up. This is the control mock-up, which set the standard for all the rest of the walls on site. And you can see that these walls are pretty substantial. This particular area is probably 12 or 15 feet high. And that's the stone coursing. And this is the terminus of one of the walls. And so it's a very robust wall. It's veneer, but it feels pretty solid. There you can see the top of the wall before the cap goes on. You can also see, this is working with Grimshaw. You can see Grimshaw's building their Croton steel walls. This is the Arrivals and the Arrivals building. And then there were some circumstances where we couldn't get the wall quite high enough for some programmatic requirements. And so there was then another layer of fencing that was applied on the back. And it follows the same logic, the sloping top. And it plays a hide and reveal game like the gate in California, the residence. And then there are a lot of gabion walls because we couldn't afford all stone walls. And this is the beginning of a gabion wall. So it's pretty robust construction. And they're quite beautiful. The stones are all hand set on the faces. And even though it's an industrial product, its craft is industrial. It's woven together in a workmanlike way, but it's quite beautiful in a kind of industrial, beautiful way. And then there's a water treatment program because the 9-acre roof sheds a lot of water, and the client is the Department of Environmental Protection. They're the folks that not only bring us our drinking water, but they also are the stormwater folks in New York City. And our stormwater is combined with our sanitary sewer, and New York City has big problems with big rains putting raw sewage into the river. And so reducing runoff is a big mandate for my client, and they wanted this project to be a demonstration project for stormwater management. So all the runoff from the roof is collected and goes through a series of stormwater treatment cells. The first cells 1 through 4 are shallow. They allow the sediments to, slowing the water down, the sediments to drop out. There's plants for phytoremediation to remove the nitrogen content because a golf course has a lot of nitrogen in its runoff. And then cells 5 and 7 are deeper, and they have rockeries in them that aerate the water by roughening the water up. And then cell 6 is an outdoor classroom so that students can come and find out about how the stormwater system works. And this is the topography for the golf course. So I had a flat roof. It was all pre-engineered. The engineers had given me enough weight load to have 8 inches of soil, which is difficult. And so this is the roof at the beginning. There are these big plenums for air intake and exhaust at the edge. They're about 12 feet high. And the entire topography is created with structural foam to create a sort of a big bowl with topography for the targets. We didn't have enough load to even bring the trucks on the site, so all the soil was done with a soil auger. And this is when it's half done. So you can see the topography created by the foam, the filter fabric over that, and the mantle of 8-inch soil going on top of that. You can also see the range poles for the netting that will surround the driving range. And then this is a mapping out of the different turf regimes. There are several types of turf with several different mowing heights. And so this was the mapping that out for the seeding operation. It was all done with seed and not sod. The targets are synthetic turf, so that's why they're green here. And this is what it looked like a year later. We used fish emulsion for fertilizer to establish this golf course. It's largely organic in terms of its maintenance. And then another view. You can see how those plenums, the vents, are really part of the landform. That's the sand trap. And there's that fuzzy edge wrapping around the edge and the range poles. And this was the first image that really showed the concept to the city agencies. And basically, the whole project is using medieval technology of moats for security and the medieval technology of moats for stormwater retention and cleaning. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. We're going to have plenty of time for your questions. I know you have questions for Ken, but it's one of the things that I like about my role here, and a part of what I like also about our June format is we can be a little bit less formal, and I get to ask a few questions. So you touched on this a little bit, Ken, already with respect to what you said about these two projects, one private client, one public, but I want to draw out a little bit more on the relationship between, what I said in my introduction was really two kinds of practice, right? A kind of cultural practice, as I called it, on the one hand, things like inflatable vinyl deities on museums, on the one hand, and then the idea of doing landscape architecture on the other hand. And I'm already overstating the difference between them, but could you say something about what it means to have both of those practices together? How do they relate? Are there relationships beyond what you've already had to say?
Yeah, so I might reconstruct the dialectic a little different. I think it's a question of scale. There are small projects and large projects, and I've always taken both because there are things you can do on a small project that you can't do on a big project, and there are things you can do on a big project that you can't do on a small project. So they both become a kind of research and development effort for each other. And so I think that is actually part of the two practices, is the big and the small. And then the other is the mix of the art projects, the speculative projects, and the real projects that have real clients and are getting built. And I think that even though when I started the deity project, it was for a show in a bar, that those projects actually, speculative projects actually are a good ground for generating ideas that ultimately move into built projects. The project that I did at the Museum of Modern Art with the camouflage roof plan is the model for the golf driving range, because in fact we're camouflaging highly sensitive place. And the golf course itself is really visually like camouflage. So they do work back and forth.
So scale and a little bit of whether it's self-generated or whether there's a client coming to you is maybe a more productive set of terms to engage with this work. That's helpful. And would those terms be more significant than the public-private distinction as well?
That's a curious one because most of even my private projects are public in some way. I mean, certainly the residences are private, but if I'm working for a developer on, say, a hotel that has a roof bar for patrons, that's a kind of public space. Or if I'm working for a corporation that has a space in the front of the building that is part of a public promenade, that's a public space. And so most private client projects still have some public dimension.
So we could say scale, small to large, and spaces for people. Would that be helpful?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Did you begin small and did the work get larger? Is that a safe assumption to make? Or could you talk a little bit about sequence in terms of the formation of your practice?
It's sort of true. When I got out of undergraduate school with a bachelor's of landscape architecture, early in my career, I was working for the State Conservation Commission in Iowa, working on state parks and recreation areas. And at that time, the state of Iowa was restoring historic parks, but also acquiring large parcels for state recreation areas. And they were typically in the thousands of acres in size. So I was actually doing master plans for recreation areas that were, 3,600 acres or 4,500 acres. So I actually had that larger scale in the earlier practice, but I was not really happy with the work because it wasn't design oriented, it was really planning oriented. And so then after graduate school, then I moved into private practice, and because I'm setting up my own practice and I didn't have any clients and nobody knew what I was doing or why, my projects were all tiny at that point. And then they each year I got to work with better architects and getting a little better project, a little bigger project, a little better budget. So that is the traditional trajectory.
You've mentioned working with architects. Obviously, you've been very, generous in crediting all your collaborators to date in the presentation. Can you say something about that working with architects? You seem to have gotten along quite well with them, at least the ones you're mentioning. And that's not always the case. And there are various relationships between landscape architects and architects that are possible. These seem to have been productive collaborations for you.
Yeah, well, when I was 13, I wanted to be an architect. And I like architecture, and I know how to make the architecture look good. And actually, I always thought that when I was in graduate school, I always thought that the architects were much more interesting in many ways in terms of how they dealt with history and theory. I always thought at that time in the mid-'80s that the landscape profession was not very theory-oriented. So I actually learned a lot from the architects in graduate school, and I always liked working with the architects because they brought ideas to the table that were generally interesting, and I like playing with those ideas, so it generally works.
Interesting. So you also touched on, and you placed this in your comments in a bit of a generational context, which is maybe interesting to follow up on. The relationship between the behavioral sciences, the social behavioral, that I think has informed the work of so many of the speakers in our series. I'm just reflecting on the last couple of years of the series here and the number of speakers that have made a point, even though their practices are known, as is yours, for high quality, high status, high culture design. They made a point of, as you did, the significance of the social and the behavioral knowledge in informing their practice. So could you say something more about that? Because it's true, in my experience in education today, it's not nearly as present as it certainly was maybe a generation ago. And at the same moment, I wonder if we're on the verge of maybe losing that generational sense as well.
Well, I would say we're on the verge of refinding it. I actually think that as I've been through 2 environmental movements now, and the sustainability movement that we've been in for the last 15 or 20 years is, I think, been largely focused on the ecologic part of the sustainability agenda, which is ecology, social equity and social space, and economics. And I think we're now moving more toward the social part of that agenda, particularly with the issues of social equity being relevant in society, and also these issues of social space. So I actually think I think we're going to see a much renewed interest in it. Maybe I'm just an optimist in
No,
that
it's
way.
certainly timely. I mean, the study of ecology in design schools has gone through a kind of renovation in the last decade, as you know, around plurality, around postmodern ideas, and it strikes me that that work could be done relative to the social and the behavioral. So sorry about all the inside baseball, but as I said, one of the indulgences of this role. Many other things to follow up on, but I know that many of you have questions about what the hell have we done here and why? And so I'll now, as you queue up your questions, we have microphones on the side. So please, anybody that has a question, just let our microphone attendants know where you are, and we'll get a microphone to you.
I was just wondering, your projects are on such a large scale and that the plants probably are sort of take the back burner. How do you choose plants? How important is the plant versus the hardscape or the geography of it?
Yeah. The plants are important. I guess when I was an undergraduate in Iowa, we learned our plants natives first. And we actually learned plant associations, what plants actually grow together in nature. And so that was actually a good basis for me. I'm probably not the most sophisticated one in terms of using the latest cultivars and knowing, which ones have the best flowers and all that stuff. But I have a pretty good basis in the plant communities and plant associations.
And do you use, as tends to be, kind of in vogue these days, horticultural consultants on projects in your practice?
I have all sorts of consultants,
Also,
but yes.
yeah.
No, but actually, soil consultant. I always have a soil consultant because if you don't have a good soil regime, you're not going to grow plants. And so actually having good soil is the best way to have good plantings. And we do more and more have plant consultants also to make sure that because if you're planting 9 acres of something, you really want to make sure that it does well.
And preferably more than 8 inches of that good soil as well.
Yeah.
It strikes me as one of the trade-offs of now being global in practice. That is, we used to learn plants as landscape architects in a regional context, and we tended to understand them in their locale as the medium of work. And as landscape practices are increasingly globalized, you're doing work in India and various parts of the world. I know it strikes me as one of the trade-offs. I think that architecture gave away a certain level of control over its material a long time ago as well. Sure.
Just a very short and specific question, Ken. The psychedelic aspect of this flower here, I almost would prefer not to ask because it's fun to speculate, but I am curious.
But now you have.
I don't know if this is the answer.
Well, it was the spiral that really drove the equation on this one, and I thought that because the spiral is such kind of a global, cultural form for people, and it has a kind of infinite quality of space. I thought that the spiral was really the key thing for this deity in terms of expressing power. But we live in a Technicolor age, and so it's psychedelic. Why not?
What do you find inspirational in contemporary pop culture?
Well, I'm a little bit of a crow by heart. I do like shiny things. So
Is that an Iowa reference? You have to unpack that for me. I'm sorry. You mean the bird, I take.
The bird, yeah. You guys don't know that reference? Crows go for shiny things.
Oh, I see.
I guess it must be what they must eat shiny things. I don't know. But crows like shiny things. And so, yes, that's the cultural reference. I like television, and I just like pop culture is very appealing. It's interesting to take pop culture seriously because it actually tells you a lot about the culture behind the pop culture. It actually tells you a lot about this kind of state of the art of humanity or the state of the art of our society. And so I guess it's one inroad into the state of our being.
You know, the question reminds me, a couple of years ago, one of the first conversations we had about this commission in your studio, Ken, I recall you had these photographs of car fenders. Did I make that up?
Taillights and headlights, because they're the most, somewhat the most expressive part of the car, and they're the most animistic. They really are the facial expressions of the vehicles.
And certainly shiny.
And they're certainly shiny.
And is that an example of a line of work that we'll now see in the public realm sometime soon? Or?
I don't know. The other thing I've been photographing, I photographed taillights and headlights, but I've also been photographing stumps for about 5 years now. And so I've got quite a collection of interesting photographs of stumps. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with those, but... Well, I think you can construct spaces that encourage chance encounters. And when I was working on the Great Park, one of the kind of struggles we were always having in California is that everything was kind of event-oriented. You know, you get in your car, and you drive someplace, and you do that. And then you get in your car, and you go somewhere else and do that. And in the basic construction, my social engineering of that park was to put things together so that they were not unitized, but actually when you went to do one thing, there would be something else that would actually, you might discover or might pull you into something you didn't expect to do. And so for me, that's one technique of what I like to do. The other part is there's a sociologist at Rutgers, Keith Hampton, who's doing interesting work. Keith somehow got a hold of all of Holly White's movies and time-lapse photography he did of public spaces. And so Keith is, with his graduate students, he's going back and he's reconducting from the very same vantage points those studies so that he can see how people today are operating socially different than they did in the 60s. And so Keith has written some interesting articles. He wrote one called The Social Life of Wireless Spaces, which is pretty clever. But it's interesting. What he's suggesting is that, contrary to popular belief, people are not less connected. They're not more alienated in public space, even with the wireless devices. He thinks that people are better connected. And the other thing that he's found in his research, which is interesting, is that since Holly White's time, with women moving into the workplace, there are a lot more working women in the public spaces, and that's really changed the way the public spaces work. So another two kind of things he's uncovered in his research. But for me, you know, talking to a sociologist is interesting because they have perspectives on how people are using public space that I don't quite know. We were working with Richard Sennett on a project, and it was a competition for one of the national mall projects. And we were doing paving studies, and Richard would come in and he would critique what we were doing. And we had a beautiful paving plan, you know, it was very, you know, kind of interesting geometry to it. And Richard came in, and Richard, of course, is maybe mostly subversive in the way he operates, but Richard came in and said that we should be using cobblestones, that the scale needed to be really small. I guess, kind of people scale in some way. And of course, also, he implicitly was saying that, you know, people needed to be able to pull up the stones if they needed to revolt, which is also kind of interesting. And so constructing a very important ceremonial public space with that as a kind of premise for the paving, I thought was actually really pretty interesting.
And did he ask you to put beach sand underneath the cobbles? I would imagine. You know, it occurs to me in that context, you referenced just briefly, projects are so hyper-programmed these days.
Yeah.
And obviously that's been, you know, a major part of what you had to say this evening, and it's true thinking back over the series in the last couple of years here. Where would the field be without that? And at the same moment, it's such a contrast with the origins of the field, right? If you think of the kind of the transcendentalist tradition and the idea of communing with nature and the building of the great public parks, including the Fens, among other things. I mean, yes, there's utility. Yes, there is a kind of program, but it's latent beyond the hydrology of it. And it does strike me that developing and articulating a position about the public realm, public landscapes, absent the hyper-programming and the retail opportunities and the et cetera that come with it would be an interesting thing to pursue further.
East River Waterfront has a dog run, exercise stations, bocce court, basketball court, a skateboard area, fishing balconies. I mean, it has all the hyper-programming.
Beer garden.
And beer garden. But I think at the end of the day, it also has a generosity of space that transcends all that. And to me, that's important.
You can access it without a ticket. I think we had one on the aisle just over here. Yes.
It actually was related to the question earlier. You mentioned about all the information that Google probably had about the movement of people. Is that possible to get a hold of that and make some sense of it? Would that be helpful or not in planning spaces?
I think there are some academic studies on scenic values that are using, because they do know where there are hotspots where people take pictures and upload their pictures. And so there are concentrations of geographic concentrations where people take pictures that are mapped digitally. And because our phones all have geographic information. And I know that it's very different than 30 years ago when Carl Steinitz would be interviewing people or maybe looking at how landscapes were portrayed in popular literature. But today, I think there is the opportunity to get that kind of digital data and actually understand where people are activated visually and try to, you know, use that as a design tool.
Yeah, there are two kinds of studies that are now, if not available everywhere, regularly enough available in our line of work. The first is the ability simply to locate where people are at various points in time. That seems relatively easy at a certain scale. And then the second is reverse engineering from Flickr to be able to reconstruct viewshed is something that we're able to do. But there's a difference in scale between that and the Holly White stuff.
Yeah.
You know, the Holly White, these kind of canonical studies were really at the scale of a set piece block or urban park or plaza. And they were much more fine-grained and very hands-on. And I think the Lynchian work that Carl was doing was quite similar. And so what I have not seen much of is at that scale, you know, because the data is available, but at a certain scale, and we have so much of it that it often eclipses as much as, you know, reveals at the scale of a kind of plaza or
But
public
I think the
garden.
start is to start asking the questions of how that data might be useful.
No doubt. I think we had one here. Yeah.
Although I admire what you said, you remind me about the issue of that social accessibility, especially for people with disability. And cobblestone will be very practical for wheelchairs and others. But how is that the issue of accessibility for everybody, including people with disability, works as you make those projects?
Well, we're working on a really challenging one in New York City in the Meatpacking District, 9th Avenue in Gansevoort, which is a beautiful area. People love it because the space of the street and the cobblestones really go from building facade to building facades, and the buildings really form the space in a way that's very gratifying for people. And people love the cobblestones, including the Landmark Preservation Commission in New York City. And so the requirement was that we were going to restore all of the cobblestones after we do the water main work that's ripping everything up. And I have to say, I agree. I think the cobblestones are beautiful, and I was a proponent of doing that. And so we had to, we actually had to map out the accessible corridors, and we actually worked with cobblestone fabricators to actually create cobblestones that are actually flat on the tops and the bottoms, and then we're tumbling them in a certain way, but such that we can still get the right kind of joints between them. And they have a sub-slab underneath them so that they maintain their perfect order. So I think that this project, is going to show that you can use that material and maintain the accessibility of it. But it's been a lot of work.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. There's just one over here, yeah.
So what I've learned from your work, like the example of the golf course and the facade by the Fenway, is that restoration work is not so much about replication anymore, but perhaps like a reframing or reframing. So do you think that the premise of restoration is changing over time? What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I was in Harrisonburg, Virginia, the last 2 days, because I'm doing a little park there, and we went to see an old 19th century mill building. Beautiful mill building, just kind of that kind of clarity of order and space that the mill building has, and it had been restored by very good restoration architects about 20 years ago. And the detailing was beautiful, it was fastidious, and everything was just, the materials was all perfect. But they had taken this beautiful space and they had carved it up in all these little tiny offices and boxes and things. And it occurred to me that they had, in fact, done everything perfectly, in terms of historic preservation materials and all that stuff. And everything had the right 19th century character and forms and stuff. But they'd actually kind of missed the big thing of what a mill building was, which is a kind of great big space for, making stuff. And it was perfectly correct, but it was also kind of perfectly wrong at the same time.
And it strikes me that in the last 15 years at least, there's been this increasing alliance between advocates of preservation, cultural heritage preservation, and landscape architects in a way that a generation before had really seen as oppositional. Yeah. I mean, certainly you see this in your work, and we see it in a range of projects such as the High Line. And in September, when Rich Haig is here, he'll talk about that presumably as well. Yeah. So I think we had a question down here. Yeah.
I was wondering if you take into account the capacity to maintain and keep up the property looking the way you originally intended it to. I mean, a lot of projects tend to, be, it's impractical because there are not enough funds to maintain the right. Look.
Well, and that's a correct question, especially for public space, because a lot of public agencies don't have the means to do it. Although there's increasingly private resources that are brought to bear, at least for certain spaces. I don't think for all of them. But it's also actually understanding the materials you're using. If you use good materials and use them in the right way, they're going to endure better. And so a lot of times you run into the problem where, because of the budgets, things have. Value engineering is actually a very tricky endeavor. But they call it value engineering when you have to cut the budget. And oftentimes what happens is that good materials become sort of simulation of what they were intended to be at a cheaper level, and they don't hold up well. And oftentimes what you really need to do is actually go to a completely different kind of material system that actually is more durable, and that's a hard transition to make. But
especially with weather conditions like we have.
Yes, yeah. I'm working on a project in India, and I'd never been there for monsoon, and so last fall I went specifically because I wanted to be there during monsoon, because I didn't really understand how the drainage systems worked or didn't work. And I came home and I completely redesigned the drainage system of my project because I really kind of got it.
Well, before we close, I did want to just take a moment and acknowledge our team. Ken, you were very kind to acknowledge your workshop and your team and Bureau Happold and the fabricators and the installers. The installation of the Fenway deity, its conception, its curation has really been a team effort here. I've had a very modest role in all of that. It's primarily been the work of the museum, and essentially every aspect of the museum, every department has been involved. But in our department, it's really been the work of Joanne Robinson. So, Joanne, if you can just take a bow. Joanne has, over the last 2 years, has worked night and day on behalf of this project, and she's still on. She's on storm watch every evening through September 20th. We have a hotline. If you see a storm coming, just call Joanne, and she can. The deity is deflatable. We know that we will, by September 20th, when the piece closes, be nudging into hurricane season, fingers crossed. And so I just want to acknowledge that, Joan. Thank you so much for all of your work. And thanks to all of you for being here. Join us September 10th for Rich Haig. Thank you, Ken Smith.